I'm here not to talk about One Medical and what we've been doing there, but really to talk about a topic that's hopefully relevant and meaningful to you, which is the concept of longevity and life expectancy. And I would imagine, it's a topic that's relevant to the industry, and I want to describe some of the forces that might be impacting that kind of trend line today. So if you look at average world life expectancy today, it's about 71, which is actually not so bad. And obviously, there will be people who live longer and less long, but where we've come from is even more dramatic. And so if you look at just 100 years ago, that life expectancy across the globe was not 60, and it wasn't 50, or even 40 years of age. Just a little over 100 years ago, that life expectancy was 31. And so if you look at the trend line that we've come from just 100 years ago to today, the question is, where do we go from here? And so if you kind of think about just the enormity of societal impact that's been made just over the last 100 years, it's one of our great achievements. The question is, how do we get there? And how do we kind of come from that place to the future? If you look at the history of that transcendence from 31 to 71, a lot of the innovations were pretty simple innovations. Clean water, public sanitation, improvement in kind of the economy in general. Right, so a lot of just kind of basic common sense notions. At the same time, we started to experience medical innovation. And the medical innovations that we started to see were along the lines of infectious diseases, particularly vaccinations and antibiotics. And the development of these medical innovations started to really change, particularly infant mortality and child mortality, such that the average life expectancy improved to where it is today. The question is, where do we go from here? If you look at kind of the natural trend line, it's been about 0.3 years for every year progress. So we're gaining on average about 0.3 years per year, about 3 years per decade of average life expectancy, which is great. And so if you follow that trend line, it follows a linear trend line, slightly improving, but relevant to where we're headed, what does that actually look like in the future? So in 50 years from now, what is life expectancy going to look like? And how does that change society? How does that change your individual lives? And how does it change your business? So does it look linear? I mean, I think certainly that's one plausibility. If you look at the historical trend line, that's a certainly plausible trend line. If you look historically, that makes a lot of sense. But the question is, society doesn't transform at a linear level. So what else is the plausible kind of path? Another plausible path that would be kind of, let's call it, kind of realistic is we're starting to hit a plateau. Right? It feels like we're hitting a plateau. That average life expectancy is going to hit some biologic ceiling. Right? There's a limitation to what we can do with medical innovation and science, and so perhaps it starts to flatten out, and average life expectancy plateaus at some age. There's a growing philosophy today that actually the inverse is true. That in fact, with all the innovations happening today, with the better science and understanding of how we age, that life expectancy is not only going to continue to improve, but accelerate. And so there's a concept here where people think that even today, there will be people who live to 200 years of age, possibly to 2,000 years of age. So the curve that we're looking at, that we want to explore today, is how is that even plausible, right? Sure, it's a nice concept, but how do we make that real and how do we understand that? So how do people actually think that? Well, I think the best place to start is looking at kind of really the causes of death as a starting point. So when you look at the causes of death just 100 years ago, it's a long list of kind of lots of random diseases that we probably don't see today, right? Hopefully we're not seeing a lot of diphtheria. And a lot of the trend line is removal of infectious diseases, as we talked about. So when you look at the remaining causes of death, that dramatic decrease in the cause of death, really we're looking at heart disease and cancer, right? And those are common and known to us, and those are the ailments that we see today. So when we kind of probe deeper on, let's call it heart disease, we say, well, how do we have the belief that we're actually going to improve longevity when we're actually having more heart disease than just a little over 100 years ago? How is that trend line even feasible, and how do we actually think that it's going to improve even further than that? Well, when you probe deeper just into heart disease alone, which is the #1 cause of death today, it tells a different story. And it tells a different story that gives us some hope. Let's look at kind of the average age-adjusted cardiovascular death rate over the last 100 years. And you can see, actually, it did increase for the first 50 years. So from 1900 to 1950, there was an increase in the cardiovascular age-adjusted death rate. But over the last 50 years, we've had enormous improvement. And we know probably some likely causes: smoking and lifestyle sensation kind of changes, adjustment in diet, and obviously medical advances in treatment, right? Advanced cardiac response, kind of pharmaceutical innovation, and obviously stent and procedural innovation. So we've seen a dramatic increase, and that trend line continues to look like it's going to continue to improve. So we see that cardiovascular disease perhaps is part of the story for that improvement. Is there another part of the story? When we look at cancer, the number 2 cause of death, it also doesn't look like a promising trend line from 100 years ago. Cancer death rates obviously increasing. But when we age adjust and think about it, back in the 1900s, people weren't achieving an age that actually was relevant to a lot of cancers. And so when you look at the same trend line across cancer death rates, again, you see this huge kind of swing in lung cancer, and we can probably guess what the cause of that was. And we can see some starting to trend line towards improvement. But the vast majority of other cancers, you're starting to see some improvements in trend line due to better prevention, screening, environment, and all other factors, age-adjusted improvement in cancer death rates. So when you kind of step back and say, well, that's actually not bad. We actually have lots of opportunity for improvement. Today, there's still 20% of the population that smokes. So that's an opportunity for improving the average life expectancy and longevity. But there are a growing number of other scientific innovations that give people increased hope. Obviously, genomic improvements, genomic splicing, telomere enhancement, the whole kind of gamut of our ability to address cancer through genomic and better immunologic science is part of the story. And then you've got what I would call kind of long tail death causes, such as motor vehicle accidents and other kind of environmental factors, and you can see how self-driving cars might be influencing that. So I would describe this gamut of what we described before and kind of these kind of potentials as what I would call incremental innovations to the causes of death and what we expect to see that give us some hope. But there's a growing camp that goes even more radical than that, and I want to describe a little bit of that camp. That camp says, yeah, that's great. Let's improve some of the diseases. There's lots of innovation in science that can improve these incrementally, but what if we can reverse aging altogether? What if we can make all of these diseases, for the most part, irrelevant by attacking a root cause phenomenon that results in these diseases? And there's a growing phenomenon led by this individual who's a biogerontologist named Avg. He's got an interesting look. I'll give you that. But he is probably the most kind of visible champion of this movement that broadly is called SENS. It's kind of funded and researched through the SENS Research Foundation. And what does SENS really stand for? It's a mouthful, right? So let me just it's strategies for engineered negligible senescence, right? So it's kind of hard to say. So SENS is going to be the shorthand for that. And the question then is, what is negligible senescence, right? It's another kind of mouthful. And the way to best describe this is the lobster. And so if you kind of take a look at the lobster is an example of a few species and organisms that exist in the world that people have studied because they tend to exhibit characteristics that defy typical aging processes. So they tend to have cells that continue to regenerate in perpetuity without kind of examples of aging cells and senescence. So when you find a lobster, it's kind of hard to tell how old it is, actually. You can dig into it, but the way it continues to perpetuate makes it somewhat immune to the typical things you would see. So they continue to reproduce in old age. They continue to kind of replicate in old age. Again, they're defying kind of the logic of what we think about as typical aging process. And so SENS is really the scientific understanding of that process in much more detail. Broadly speaking, what does that look like? And so when you think about the aging process from a SENS kind of point of view, at a high level, we have cells that make up our body, that do stuff, right? And they're metabolizing. And a byproduct of that metabolism we can call ballparkish kind of damage, right? There's stuff that accumulates, stuff that causes cells to not function as if they were young cells, they function like old cells. And that's damage. And if you get enough damage, then that results in pathology. So that's the stuff that we see in the diseases and kind of all the typical characteristics that we see of the aging process. And so when you look at the kind of the disciplines that are currently in present today, there's gerontology, which is understanding kind of the process that accumulates damage. So there's movements that believe that a low-calorie diet can reduce the harmful accumulation of damage effects. And then the study of geriatrics, which is obviously once you have those damaged cells and diseases, how do you better mitigate and manage those, which is the vast majority of what we just discussed in the concern of diseases. But the SENS movement thinks about a different alternative strategy. And it's a third strategy that focuses on the damage itself, and it has more of an engineering approach to the damage, saying, hey, well, there's no way to really figure out all the metabolism that goes on to create the damage. It's really complicated. And once you've got too much damage, you're kind of down a dead end. So it's really kind of just putting salve on a broken problem. But if we could attack the damage through scientific discovery and innovation in a much more explicit way, reduce the damage, remove the damage, and fix the damage, that's the thesis of what SENS is really looking at. And this is not based in hypotheticals. There is what I would call a very structured approach to how people are thinking about this from a research methodology. This research has kind of existed in various forms over 30, 50 years. And there are discrete strategies, which we're not going to go into today, obviously. That's too detailed. But very deliberate strategies that tip the balance from damage creation to damage repair. And so you start to change that equation at a cellular level from increasing that damage to possibly neutralizing and balancing that. So that's the concept of SENS. So then the question then is, how does that impact longevity? So this is a simple example to describe this concept of how people can achieve immortality. If you take a cell at the beginning of its life, it's got max reserve, and then over the damaging process over time, you've got a min reserve, and then that results in kind of death, right? So at a broad level, from an organism's perspective, you go from kind of max health to death. Let's say it's ballparkish 100 years, and that's kind of the base case today, right? Now, if you could somehow in 50 years change that equation incrementally and say, let's just improve the cellular reserve, tip the balance enough. We're not making any breakthrough dramatic changes, but we're just saying we're altering the cellular equation enough to give you a few more years. What does that look like? Well, then you've got clearly a little bit more longevity. And in another 50 years, we figure out new discoveries that improve it incrementally again. Then what does that result in? Now you've extended life beyond 50 years, 50 years more than you would have expected. So that's the concept of what we call achieving escape velocity, which is if the innovations can outpace time, we're better off. So taken to the next extreme, knowing that innovations and discovery tend to increase exponentially as information science and better kind of diagnostic and therapeutic tools become available at the cellular level, let's run through a situation where you have improving kind of equations. So you have the same improvement in 50 years, but in 50 years thereafter, you've actually had incrementally better improvement, right? Scientific discovery has accelerated to the point where now every 50 years, you're getting better improvement. This is the concept of achieving longevity escape velocity. This is the concept that many smart people say, there are people alive today that could live to 150, 200, or even 1,000 years. So when these discoveries happen, and if they happen, the question is, when do they happen? And this is kind of one of the fun concepts that people kind of look at, saying if they're discovered when you're old, you're kind of at the tail end, and unfortunately you're going to be hitting the ground. But if, for whatever reason, the incremental improvements are enough at the age of 50, there are some people at age 50 who may just clear the bar, And so if you're younger than 50 today and you believe this curve, you can feel a little bit more confident, but it really depends on when these discoveries occur. And so there is this thesis where the first 1,000-year-old living is only 10 years younger than the first 150-year-old. And it's a little bit odd to think about, but that is kind of the scientific basis for how people think about this. Now, let's go back a little bit to reality before we finish. This is what we know. So we kind of expanded one aspect of the longevity curve. Obviously, there's an equal number of arguments that could say that we're going to hit the flattening of the curve. At some level, these are relevant things that will happen in society over the next 10, 20, 50 years. How you interpret that, how you individualize that for yourself, and how you factor that into the risk and direction of life and your business is really up to you. And so I'll just leave you with this final quote, which is, prediction's really difficult, and especially if it's about the future. So thank you for taking the time.